Thank you for being with me today. I'm Madeline Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about opening possibilities so that you have options from which to choose when life asks you to make a decision. There are so many forces that put stress on us. There's pressure to perform, and not only to perform, but to perform faster and faster. We have more traffic to deal with. We have security issues to deal with. We sometimes just feel totally inadequate for what we have to do. And sometimes we don't even feel like we belong. And let's not talk about expectations from family. We place enormous burdens on ourselves, and there is little doubt to reason why the stress piles up. And today we're going to be talking about the cure for stress that is built in. Dr. Greg Hammer is returning to Unlocked for the third time. He is a professor at Stanford University School of Medicine. He's a pediatric intensive care physician, a pediatric anesthesiologist, a mindfulness expert, and the author of Gain Without Pain, the Happiness Handbook for Healthcare Professionals. Dr. Hammer is a health enthusiast and meditator utilizing mindfulness-based approach, including the GAIN method. Without further ado, Greg Hammer, welcome back to Unlocked.
Thank you, Madeline. Wonderful to be with you again.
Thank you. I get so excited about the fact that we're going to be talking about stress because everybody I deal with says there's something in their life that makes them feel overwhelmed. And I have to ask, you're an anesthesiologist. In my imagination, I can see that it must be a stressful position. After all, the life of the patient is in your hands and in the surgeon's hands, and you can't control the surgeon. You can only control what you do. How does that feel, and what's the stress in those situations?
That's a wonderful question. It is a stressful occupation. Interestingly, I think that's one of the things I like about it because it's a situation in which acute stress is adaptive. And we can talk about acute versus chronic stress. Acute stress response is an adaptive response that has arisen over many tens of thousands of years of evolution, if you will, whereby our sympathetic nervous system is activated, and that results in changes mediated by hormones that prepare our bodies for fight or flight, let's say. And as it became in its current form by evolution, it's adaptive because we need to prepare our bodies for one of those alternatives. Running away from predators is a key example, or if we can't escape, then we need to be prepared to fight. And so those changes include an increase in adrenaline in our body, also called epinephrine in the United States, adrenaline in the UK, and I think that's probably the lay term. Cortisol is another hormone that's released in circumstances of acute stress. That causes our blood sugar to go up. The adrenaline causes our heart to contract more forcefully and more rapidly so that it's pumping blood to our muscles, which need more blood flow, which means more oxygen. The cortisol, as I said, increases our blood sugar. The hormone glucagon does the same thing. So there's more energy substrate to be delivered to our muscles to run or fight. And there are a number of other hormones that are affected. Some are depressed, like thyroid hormone and a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, which has to do with our libido. We don't need a libido when we're in a fight or flight circumstance. So we've all experienced this sympathetic response. We could talk about the thing that keeps it in check and that we need to utilize to reduce, to bring this acute stress response back down to baseline. That's our parasympathetic nervous system. And but in the meantime, I guess my point is that I'm someone who tends to have their acute stress response easily activated. And so at least when I'm taking care of patients in the OR or the intensive care unit, that's adaptive. So I can kind of go with it and use it to help me really focus. That's another thing that happens with acute stress is we become hyper vigilant. So those things are
Mhm.
addictive for me at work. And of course, I don't want to remain maximally acutely stressed for 10 or 12 hours at a time. So I've learned how to tamp it down during those intervals where it's not necessarily adaptive to have the acute stress response activated. But certainly during key moments, it's a good thing for me. It's interesting. It reminds me of the way our brains are wired. We have a negativity bias, and we're also very distracted by thoughts of the future and the past. We have a hard time being present. And the combination of our future mindedness, which is often maladaptive, and our negativity bias is that we tend to catastrophize when we think of the future. And again, that's usually maladaptive. But for me at work, it's actually adaptive because it's important for me to consider what the worst thing that might happen is so that I can prevent it
Mhm.
from happening or deal with it if it does happen. So it's just kind of interesting. These natural ways that our bodies respond are sometimes adaptive, unfortunately, often maladaptive, but I enjoy the thrill and the acute stress response associated with my job. So I use it to my advantage.
I think for the first time, I've begun to understand what is going on chemically in my body when I'm under stress. Uh, I've always thought about it from a behavioral standpoint, from a feeling standpoint. It's exciting to hear that we understand the chemistry behind it and how our bodies have developed so that we really can deal with stress. Thank you for that. Even though that was not the question I asked.
You asked me about, isn't it
Yeah,
stressful being at work
yeah.
and so on, and the stress response. And my answer is that yes, it is stressful, but in many circumstances in my life, at work in particular, the acute stress response is adaptive. And then I fold it in this other way we tend to think, which is related to our negativity bias and our distraction with the future as well as the past. And so those are also adaptive in some cases in my life, which I enjoy. So I enjoy using these
Mm.
natural bodily responses to my advantage. And then I think maybe an inference in your question was, how do you deal with that? And how do we bring that acute stress response back down to a healthy level
Mhm.
or baseline? And so we can obviously talk much more about that, but I think that's probably one reason that I've spent so much time thinking about neutralizing the acute stress
Yeah.
response and bringing our bodies back into homeostasis.
Mm. And I really appreciate the fact that you said that's something you actually enjoy about your work, which is why, in addition to wanting to help people, it doesn't get in the way of that help. I think that's great.
So people enjoy bungee jumping or all kinds of things that induce the acute stress response. So they enjoy that feeling, hopefully only on a temporary basis when it is adaptive for whatever the activity at hand might be.
But I want to take this another step, which is we've been talking about the adaptive side, which sounds pretty good. We know we're going into a situation or we want to be ready for it. But what happens if we can't shut that off and we live with long periods? And there are jobs like air traffic controllers where it's hours of this. Talk a little bit about what happens in the long periods. What are the ramifications of stress on stress?
I think being an air traffic controller or a pilot has something in common with being an anesthesiologist and intensive care physician. So yes, I can be in a very stressful situation all day. And
Mm,
of course, I'm exhausted at the end of that, as I'm sure those air traffic controllers are at the end of their shift. But I think it's okay to be stressed when it's adaptive, even for hour after hour. The important thing is, again, neutralizing that acute stress response as soon as it's no longer adaptive. And so that means just at the end of the
mm,
shift, you go home, obviously, for social and family related reasons, you don't want to bring that home
mm,
and be acutely stressed when you're with your family. So it's really important to acquire tools through practice. And it's a process and it requires the gain elements, which we can talk about. But it's very important to adopt a practice or practices that help us bring our acute stress mediators back down to a healthy homeostatic level. And so, to your question about the air traffic controller, yes, as long as that individual, like someone in my position, learns how to quickly bring that level of stress back down to baseline, I don't think they suffer, or I suffer, or someone in my profession suffers, or a pilot suffers long-term adverse consequences. It's okay to have acute stress when it's adaptive. The important thing is to, again, to neutralize all those chemical changes as quickly as possible when it's no longer adaptive.
I want to push this just a little bit further before we get into some of the mitigation, so to speak. How about the person who is caring for a very sick family member? And this doesn't go on for hours. This goes on for days, months, even potentially for years. These are often very stressful situations. What are the ramifications to the body that happens when you're in that long-term stress?
That's a great question. And I'll just take a step back and say that I think we're all under that level of stress,
Mm,
or a level of chronic stress at the moment. I was just out with my dog and my cul-de-sac, my wonderful neighbors and their dogs. The dogs were playing and we were talking. And really, the topic this morning was how absolutely sad and depressing what's going on in the world is with
mm,
regard to Israel and Gaza. Seems to be a very depressing, sad, awful situation for so many people without an apparent solution. And similarly in Ukraine.
mm,
And on a lesser note, in some ways, what's happening in our political system right now,
mhm,
just so much divisiveness. So there are so many things going on right now around us that affect us in a very profound way. And so I think and we're still suffering some of the ill effects of the pandemic.
yeah.
And so we're all stressed at a baseline. And then when you have something, as you mentioned, like a sick family member, it just adds another level. And again, I mentioned owing to the GAIN principles, which, as you GAIN is an acronym for what I think are the four pillars of happiness. And keeping stress at a minimum is important in order for us to be happy. And they include gratitude, acceptance, intention, and non-judgment. So
Mm,
we all go through really difficult times in life. It's part of life. So during those times, we need to focus even more on that for which we're grateful, because
mm,
I would say almost all of us have lots for which to be grateful. And then the A in GAIN is acceptance. As the Serenity Prayer would have it, we need to discern between what we can change and what we can't change. And for most of us, we cannot change what's happening in the Middle East or
mhm,
in Ukraine, for example, and we can't change very much what's happening in Washington. So we need to identify things we can't change and learn to accept them. And interestingly, even embrace them. And so we can talk about that if you'd like, but I think that's part of the GAIN practices is going through a contemplative transition from gratitude to acceptance to intention, which is required because, as I said, we all have a negativity bias and we all have a difficult time appreciating the present moment, the only moment we ever truly experience.
mm,
And happiness is in the present moment. So if we're going to be more positive and more present, we need to have a strategy. We need to have a plan. We need to be purposeful. I think we need to have a daily practice.
mm,
And then the end in GAIN is non-judgment. For example, not to be so political about it, but when that awful bombing of the hospital or the parking lot adjacent to the hospital in Gaza was publicized, many people immediately assumed that the Israelis had bombed the hospital and quickly went to judgment
mm,
of those in charge in Israel. And they may well judge those individuals or that segment of the Israeli population for other reasons now. But going back to that particular event, people jump to conclusions and they're very judgmental. And it turns out, of course, as far as I know, it was in fact Palestinian errant bomb, not an Israeli bomb.
Mm.
And I'm not taking sides either way. I'm just saying that we do tend to respond to what we perceive, things we see, things we hear, with judgment. And when we judge, we are not seeing the world as it truly is.
Mm.
We're tainting our perception with our own biases
Yep.
and preconceptions. And so the end and gain is also important. We need to learn how to let go of judgment, in particular of ourselves, since we are certainly our own most harsh critics.
Mm. One of the things that I know we plan to talk about is what's actually built into us to help us mediate, shall we say, these stress responses. I said it's the vagus nerve. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Who is this thing in here, and what role does it play?
Sure. As I said, we have a component of our nervous system, the way we are literally wired, that includes what's called our autonomic nervous system. So you could think of it as our automatic nervous system, that those nerves that get activated without us having to think about it. So that would be distinct from, for example, our motor nervous system, which are those nerves that activate muscles in our body when we're walking or when we're sitting, when we're breathing, when we're existing. We have muscular activity, and that's our motor nervous system. And we have a sensory nervous system where we perceive, touch, taste, sound, etc. But our autonomic nervous system is automatic, and it has two components. One component, as we've discussed a little bit, is the sympathetic nervous system, and that is the system that modulates acute stress. And when that acute stress is not does not abate, then it becomes chronic stress. And the acute stress can be adaptive. It can also be maladaptive. It's triggered just by thoughts.
Mm.
And so we may activate the sympathetic nervous system unnecessarily just by thinking of something, perceiving danger or something that makes us anxious. That's maladaptive. The other side of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic nervous system. So pretty much all systems in our body, there's if you will, an excitatory side and an inhibitory side, and a side that raises chemicals in our body, and another component of our physiology that lowers those substances in the body. So there's insulin that raises our blood sugar. There's glucagon that removes sugar from the blood and deposits it in our liver and muscles, for example. And those two hormones, insulin and glucose, are in a state of balance, which determines our resting or fasting blood sugar. So we have all these systems in our body that are elegantly designed to work together to cause a balance. And so the parasympathetic nervous system, largely mediated through this vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in our body, it comes from our brain and it goes to virtually all of our organs. The parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve specifically keep our sympathetic nervous system in check so that we have homeostasis. So we have adrenaline that accelerates our heart rate, makes our heart beat more forcefully. And we have a parasympathetic nervous system, or the vagus nerve with branches to the heart, that slow the heart rate and help the heart relax. And these two are in some kind of balance. Now the balance gets out of whack. So when the vagus nerve is overbalanced, if you will, by its sympathetic nervous system counterpart, our resting heart rate is elevated and our heart is doing extra work. And this is not good, but it's a manifestation of chronic stress where we have sort of chronically elevated adrenaline in our body. And similarly, with chronic stress, we have an increase in cortisol. So our blood sugar gets elevated and our tissues gradually get more resistant to insulin. So we develop type 2 diabetes in those cases. So the
Wow, there's real
parasympathetic,
implications here.
pardon me?
I said there's real serious implications.
Oh, yeah. Your bodies ideally are in this magical, wondrous, inspiring state of balance. But there are many forces, internal and external, to our bodies that upset this balance. And so
Mm.
Back to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is extremely important in bringing our bodies back into a healthy homeostasis and help us recover from acute stress before it becomes chronic and basically debilitating in just about every physiologic manner you can imagine.
It's from what you say, it's really a key player here. But
Absolutely.
now I'm sitting here saying, well, these things work magically. I don't have to think about them. But is there a way that I can influence them to help them do their work?
Yes. So these autonomic nervous system functions are operating without us having to think about it. And they get sometimes out of balance without us having to think about it. And that's chronic stress is not something that we're necessarily always thinking about something stressful. It's just the net perception or sensations in our bodily systems react in such a way so as to create chronic stress, chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system without us thinking about it. But the good news is, and in some cases, the not so good news is that our thoughts and our ways of living can influence intentionally so
Mm.
the function and strength of both our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So I said, we can be sitting here talking and suddenly one of us might think of something, oh my gosh, I've got so many things to do today. I've got this list of things. It activates our sympathetic nervous system. We can actually feel we're getting anxious. If we checked our heart rate, it would be elevated. Our blood pressure might be going up. Our blood sugar might be going up just by thinking about everything we have to do today, as you and I were talking about before we started recording. We can also have thoughts and ways of being and behaving that activate our parasympathetic nervous system, i.e. the vagus nerve. And there are many ways we can do this, including some ways that involve special tools that we might apply to our earlobe or other parts of our body. I think those are unnecessary for most of us unless we have some clear disorder, but because we can activate the vagus nerve by our way of breathing. And that's why our gain meditation, among others, I think the breath is so important to every kind of meditation, as far as I know, starting with focusing on the breath and slowing it down and deepening it. This actually activates the vagus nerve. So just sitting in a quiet place in a comfortable manner, breathing slowly in through your nose, focusing on this, perhaps to a count of 3, filling your chest, pausing to a count of 3, and then intentionally, but without effort, letting the breath go very slowly to a count of 4. If each count is 1 second, then our total breathing cycle, if you will, is 3 plus 3 plus 4 equals 10. And so that means we're breathing 6 times a minute. And when we breathe deeply and slowly with this intention, we activate our vagus nerve. And so this naturally slows our heart rate, allows our heart to relax and do less work, endure less strain, if you will, relaxes our blood vessels, lowers our blood pressure, lowers our blood sugar, and gets our hormones and bodily physiology back in a very nice homeostasis. It actually might result in a little bit of excessive parasympathetic activation, which is fine. There's no such thing as a heart rate that's too slow or a heart that's too relaxed unless we're passing out or getting very dizzy when we stand up. So it's healthy to have generally a low resting heart rate and having a heart that's not straining every time it contracts. So yes, we can do this with the breath. There are other ways. We can do this by putting an ice pack on our face, by pressing on our eyes. And I don't recommend that we do that because we might rupture our globe. But when I see patients who have a rapid heart rate, an arrhythmia called supraventricular tachycardia or SVT, we can often break that with activation of the vagus nerve. So their heart rate might be 220 or 250, which is not healthy and probably isn't sustainable, by putting an ice pack on the face. Or I could theoretically do it by compressing someone's orbits, their eyes a bit. or having them strain. But the more common ways of doing it would be an ice pack to the face. Another way to activate the vagus nerve is to get into a cold shower or a tub of cold water, ice water even. Of course, the initial response to getting in a tub of ice water is going to be activation of the sympathetic nervous system. But after a short period of time, that will abate, and we have a diving reflex. You might think of it as that. And our heart rate slows and we activate the parasympathetic nervous system. I think that's one reason that it is so refreshing. So there's actually studies that underscore the therapeutic benefit of temperature extremes up to a point, of course. Get your body very hot and then very cold.
It finally explains to me why the Finns love their saunas, and then
followed by jumping into the Baltic.
The
sauna then followed by jumping into the Baltic. But yes, I've experienced that in Sweden several times. I have had the pleasure of being in a wood-burning sauna on an island off the coast of Stockholm several times, and with all kinds of family members without clothing. It's just part of their culture. Getting very hot till you practically can't stand it anymore by throwing water and more wood on the wood-burning element in the sauna. And then just when you can't take the heat anymore, exiting the sauna, running off a pier into the Baltic and ice cold water. I mean, it's when you get out, even you will never have felt so invigorated, healthy, refreshed for some period of time. So people are doing that now because it's also representative of a healthy type of stress. So not only are you activating the parasympathetic nervous system, but there's another component about this practice that's healthy, which is a type of bodily stress that, when limited in duration, actually is healthy. That's called hormesis. So that's probably a different topic, but so many interesting things to learn about with our physiology, and so many ways we can manipulate our physiology with intention in ways that improve our health and longevity even.
What I really appreciate about our conversation so far is that you've given me some physical things like the breathing, the ice pack, a cold shower. I mean, these are physical things that you can choose to do right now, this moment. I tend to advise people from a behavioral side. Start your morning by picking only the top 3 things that are the most important on your to-do list. Forget about the rest. Just get those 3 done. It's amazing at how it reduces stress through the day. And taking 5 minutes in silence just to calm yourself. And what I love is that this is a lovely combination of mental activities versus some very physical ones.
Absolutely. And they're not mutually exclusive, of course. They have added or maybe even synergistic benefits. Another thing you can do when you get up in the morning that I find very helpful is, due to our negativity bias, and you, Madeline, as well as I do, we start to get negative as soon as we wake up. So we begin to awaken and we notice that our back is kind of stiff. Okay. Maybe our joints as we get older are stiff in the morning, and we end up focusing on that. So we have the same thoughts every morning. We get up, oh, my back. And then we fixate on our physical maladies. Then we go into the bathroom, and excuse me if I'm being too graphic here, but then we empty our bladders, but we're still kind of a little bit negative on what our body is doing. Instead, as soon as we start having those negative thoughts about our aching back, focus on something amazing about our physiology. So all night while we were asleep, our kidneys were filtering our blood. They were removing things that would be toxic if allowed to have an increased concentration over time. So they remove those out of our bloodstream. They send them down through this tube called the ureter to our bladder, and our bladder kindly stores that liquid until we wake up. Now, we might have to get up once or even twice during the night to empty our bladder, but still, our bladder is being kind to us by giving us a break in between. So we get up and we start to complain about our back, and then we focus on something positive and amazing about our bodies instead of what's wrong with our bodies. And our kidneys are doing this magic thing. Our ureters are cooperating. Our bladders are cooperating. And then when we actually make it to the commode and empty our bladder, it's like an amazing process. It's all these things working in concert. Your bladder muscles are contracting, the sphincter muscle that leads to the outside world is relaxing, and it feels good, especially if your bladder's full. So it's just this kind of a slightly humorous example of how we wake up with these negative thoughts. And it could be, as you suggested, the list of things we have to do. But
Yeah.
just, I think when you have a daily practice, and I love what you said that you practice and probably recommend, but when we have a daily practice, a light bulb goes off when we start to get anxious, when we start to have this sort of self-activation of our sympathetic nervous system in a maladaptive way. A light bulb goes off and we switch to activating the vagus nerve by taking slow, deep breaths, by switching our negative thoughts to focusing on the positive thoughts,
Mhm.
by remaining silent, as you suggested. That's parasympathetic activity. Yeah, there's so many magical ways we can take advantage of the way our bodies and our minds work to make us healthier and happier and live longer, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to tell you a funny story about this. I have learned, thanks to hearing you and many people talk about stress, I now, when I go to the dentist, ask them to please don't do anything until I have done some belly breathing for at least 5 minutes. They laughed at me in the beginning, but then they realized I was much more relaxed through the whole operation.
Yeah, and even if you had forgotten to mention that, you can start your slow, deep
Yep.
breathing when they are starting their work. It's always a good time to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've been talking about us, and I certainly can relate to the to your morning scenario that you just described. But I'm also thinking, what about children? What about especially teens that are, oh my goodness, even if they were living in an idyllic world, their bodies are making so many changes during the teen years. There's got to be stress just from that alone. Talk a little bit about that and how a teenager can help themselves or how we can help them.
As you and I discussed briefly before we began recording, that's the topic of my book that I'm working on now, called A Mindful Teen. I think teens undergo a lot of physiologic changes, as you suggested, that create stress. But there are just so many other things that create stress for teenagers now, too, that you and I did not experience.
Right.
That I'd be wearing a bulletproof vest when I go to school.
Mm.
Am I a boy or a girl?
Mm-hmm.
What's happening with social media? Teens are spending an average of 3.5 hours a day on social media. I don't know if they have time to get their homework done, but they're also being exposed to a lot of stressful stimulation on social media. A lot of, for so many reasons, that would be a separate conversation. Is there going to be a world for my children and my grandchildren? Is the earth going to sustain my children and their children? Sort of eco-anxiety, which is well-founded. What's happening? Why are my parents and other people's parents disagreeing about so many things and not talking to each other, and how divisive our society has become? It's just a litany of things that you and I really didn't experience, some of which we didn't experience at all, and some of which we didn't experience to the extent that they're active now. So in summary, in terms of my response to your question, what can we do about that to help them? I think the first thing we can do is practice mindfulness ourselves. Learn how to convert those negative thoughts we have related to our negativity bias to positive, grateful, accepting, purposeful, non-judgmental thoughts, the GAIN acronym, if you will. Learn how to deal with each other as adults in a kind, compassionate, mindful way. Learn how to let go of judgment of others, including those of a different political persuasion or those we believe are perpetrating awful things around the world. Drop the judgment. So when we act in a way that's responsible and frankly grateful, accepting, intentional, and non-judgmental, our kids are watching us.
Yeah.
And it has a tremendous effect on them. And I think half of the way they learn is through watching their parents.
I would dare say most of what they learn is by watching the world, and their parents are a part of that world. That's right. And I always think of my mother, who always said to me, "Don't worry about what you say to your child, Madeline. Just do what you want them to do."
Yes,
Yeah. So I'm hearing the same thing. Let us begin with ourselves and then be
absolutely.
that person for the young people. Mm, that's actually very encouraging
Yes, it
because it
is
says
because
there's already a system in place.
and things are not beyond our control to some extent, at least, I think to a very significant extent.
I also, as you talked about the various methods that you're suggesting, I like that they are non-invasive. It's so easy to say, well, you just get this little operation or this something. But every time I think of my body being opened up and being exposed to germs, I say, is there another way? And so I'm really pleased that what you're talking about is that sort of thing.
Yes, because there are certainly devices that are available for activating the vagus nerve, or at least they purport to activate the vagus nerve, things that stimulate the earlobes. And yes, there's even surgeries for that with implantable devices. But I think most of us can accomplish the same thing just by simple methods such as controlling our breath, maybe using some temperature extremes, etc.
So if I do the slower breathing when I need to, I call it belly breathing because that's how I learned it. I love the idea of the ice on my face. I would just, who would have thought? I'll never take a cold shower though. Sorry. Uh, but I love the fact that I know now that these are some physical things I can use to ease and basically teach my body and mind uh,
Yes.
what to do and how to do it. Are there other things that we can employ? And I want to talk a little bit about your word intention, because intention is incredibly powerful. Oftentimes, when I talk to managers and we're dealing with all kinds of issues, they may be stress related or not. But I say to them, if you're working with someone, you've got to have the right intentions about them because your intentions are going to be speaking much louder than any words or instructions you can give them. I wonder if you'd make a little comment about that.
We'll go back to what I think is the foundation of the importance of intention. And that is, as I said, our brains are wired through tens of thousands of years of evolution in ways that tend to interfere or apparently interfere with our happiness, which I think is our true nature. And they include that we have this negativity bias. It's not our dirty little secret. Oh my God, I have all these negative thoughts. And if people knew this, they wouldn't want to associate with me. No, we're all wired that way. And we also have a very hard time being present. We're very distracted with going back to thoughts of the past and the future. And when we go back to all these ruminations of the past with our negativity bias, it leads to a lot of regret and shame and depression. And when we overthink the future with our negativity bias, we tend to catastrophize, and this leads to fear and anxiety. So anxiety and depression being two of the major manifestations of mental illness in our society, I think largely come from an exaggerated manifestation of the way all of our brains are wired, this negativity and this distraction. If you want to be positive and present and happy, you have to have a plan. If you don't have purposefulness, you lapse into this old habit of being very negative and distracted. So just as John Kabat-Zinn defined mindfulness, awareness of the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. The on purpose is a key ingredient in mindfulness and happiness. And so you have to have a plan. And ideally, you would have a daily practice. And I think if you had a daily practice, like the gain practice, for example, you would automatically bring that intention to your daily life. So when you're interacting with a coworker or a friend, your intention would become manifest. So when you're interacting with a coworker, as you said, whereas you might normally go to a negative way of interacting, assuming the worst, maybe not giving them the benefit of the doubt if you're having a dispute or even trying to make a plan for some project, you have a more positive way of being, and you have a more present way of being, which means you can listen. Because if you're not present, you're not listening.
Yep.
So again, it's this intentional way of living and being that gradually becomes more predominant in the way that you are, if you have a practice, if you have that intention.
Yeah. It reminds me a great deal of when I work with groups, especially where they want to solve problems. And it's that negativity bent. This problem, there's this problem, there's this problem, there's this problem. If that's the only word that you're going to talk about, that you're only going to see problems. And one of the challenges I say to them is, well, I'd like you to tell me about a time that you were really proud of what you did. You can see a whole shift in people when they finally go, oh, yes, I remember there's this event, and they will describe it to each other. And before you know it, the whole tenor of the group has elevated, and they begin to find solutions instead of talking about just the problem, because they suddenly discover, my goodness, in our stories, we have lots of things to bring to the table. It reminds me even of your morning exercise of getting out of bed saying, gee, thank you, body. You did all this wonderful stuff last night. Now let me tend to you other ways instead of thinking about the aches. For positives.
I couldn't agree with you more.
I can't believe we're almost out of time. This has been such an interesting conversation.
Let's do it again.
We will. I know we will. Okay, I have to say, is there a final comment that you want to make to our audience?
I would just like anybody who's listening to really embrace and appreciate, in this very difficult time for all of us, to remember that our brains are wired in certain ways, and we all tend to be a bit negative. We all tend to be a bit depressed at times. We all tend to be anxious at times. We all have a hard time being present. We're making lists, we're ruminating, and we're all like this. So it's nobody's dirty little secret. And the good news is our brains can adapt. We have this wonderful quality called neuroplasticity. We can change the way we think and change the way we experience. And so be optimistic. Don't feel isolated. Talk to a friend. Go out for a walk in the neighborhood and talk to your neighbors, and just realize that you're not alone. You're not the only person whose brain appears to be wired this way. There's hope for all of us.
Thank you. Third time still, you're a joy to listen to, with all of the wisdom that you bring and the expertise that you bring about this particular subject called stress. And that we really can, I hate to say this, but we can practice our way out of it, I think.
Agreed.
Good. Greg Hammer, thank you so much for being with me on Unlocked.
Always great, Madeline. I look forward to our next opportunity.
Thank you so much. It's time for a book of impact. Today's book is called Resonate, Present Visual Stories That Transform Audiences, by Nancy Duarte. And you can probably see that I use this book a lot. I give a lot of speeches and presentations, and I'm always considering how to help the audience really become engaged enough to listen and then to act upon what I have to say. Well, before I got this book, I knew a lot about storytelling. That book, by the way, came out in 2010, and it's still considered the Bible on this. So I understood about setting the scene, identifying the characters, presenting the problem, and finally offering a solution and a call to action. I understood that story structure. What I didn't see was the interpretation of this in a simpler form that rides over this more complex parts of the speech. Her book talks about how to organize the parts of the speech and then offers examples of some of the most famous speakers, such as Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, Steve Jobs. I doubt I have to tell you who Steve Jobs is. They spoke remarkably, clearly, and engagingly. Of all of them, though, the one that stopped me in my tracks was the chapter called Value Brevity. This chapter is about Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Duarte lays out the speech as occurring in 3 steps: what is, what could be, and what she called the new bliss. In that document, that book, this is what that page looks like. She took the actual address and she showed you this is the beginning, the moment of what is, then what could be, and finally the new bliss. By the way, this is page 177. I personally love lists of 3. It's a magic number of things. And it's a number that virtually everybody can keep in their minds at the same time. I'm forming a presentation. If I only have to think about 3 things that I have to judge it on, it's great. I don't have to look up and say, now, what am I doing now? What am I doing now? No, I've got the 3 in my head and I can look and I can say, I'm really doing it. I've got all the 3 pieces. It's a true way to make the presentation much better. Also, I have always loved brevity. I studied mathematics when I was in college. And in mathematics, you're always looking for the elegant solution, the brevity of it. It's just got to be a pattern of how I think, which sounds much like what Greg was just talking about. In fact, it turns out now that my publication called Mentalespresso offers you basically a gem that was told in less than a minute by one of my guests. It's quick, and I like to think that it is also an aromatic cup of espresso. You are engaged by the opening question, asking about what is. You catch the fragrance of that cup when you read the question about what could be, and then you taste the answer as one of my guests speaks for less than a minute of the new bliss. As you watch the response by the expert, here is an example of a mental espresso. This happens to be one of my guests by the name of Diana Whitney, and she is speaking about what is your career?
What is it that I offer? And that's the point of one's calling. My favorite definition of calling is that it's the intersection of our greatest gifts and the world's greatest needs.
Notice how in less than a minute, you got a real sense of how Diana saw the question, which was really, what is your calling? And you noticed what is your calling is that what is. I asked her how she viewed her career. That's a possibility. And then her answer is the bliss, the intersection between what is your greatest gifts and talents and the world's greatest needs. Beautiful, simple. I am so grateful for that single lesson that I learned from Duarte, her amazing book, Resonate, present visual stories that transform audiences. She has written a series that expands on this book, including Illuminate, Slideology, Data Story. All of these are on my bookshelf too. You can register, by the way, to get Mental Espresso if you are so inclined by simply signing up on my website. Go to madelineblair.com/mental-espresso and sign up for it. Once a week, you get a Mental Espresso. And if you want to explore something further, I offer 30-minute conversations for free. Just email me, madeline@madelineblair.com, and we'll set up a time. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a pleasure. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation and that you learned something. I'm Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.